Hey everybody, it's your boy Crimson Cast coming to you with another think piece rage bait YouTube video for you to type essays in the comments. And this time we're going to talk about ground loot. So first I want to have a definition of terms about ground loot, because a lot of people use the term in different ways. And I think that those ways are misaligned with what the consensus definition of the term ground loot is. So let's be clear. If you say that you want better ground loot, that is a different thing than saying that you want better chase uniques, or that you want exceptional bases to be more common, or other various things that people mean. Some people even mean that you want better currency drops, and you want currency drops to feel more impactful. That's not what, at least in the history of ARPGs, praise for systems of good ground loot means. So I'm just going to go ahead and define it for the purposes of today's video, that when I refer to people wanting good ground loot, they're saying that they want good rare item drops, and they want identifying rare item drops to be particularly powerful. Because we have terms for the other things. You can say you want better chase uniques. You can say that you want exceptional bases to be more impactful. There are a lot of other options for you to express what you mean. But ground loot refers to items as they are when you pick them up off of the ground. And that means that you're talking about naturally occurring rare items. I don't think that most of the player base actually wants on-the-ground rare items to be better. And to understand why, we have to talk a little bit about the history of crafting in ARPGs. And right now, you're looking at the only crafting system that exists in Diablo 1, the father game of the whole modern ARPG genre. And that's shrines. And shrines offered extremely limited item modifiers. First off, shrines were rare, and second, the item modifiers that they offered were like +2 to maximum damage, -1 to durability, and that buff only persisted until you restarted your game. The item wasn't tradable, and the item couldn't change from game instances, and you only had it for the rest of that play instance. And that was it for item modifiers, which meant that if you picked up a sword off the ground and it had a couple of the best modifiers, even if it had 2 or 3 or 4 stats that were completely irrelevant to your build, that was super exciting because the chance of it happening was super low and there was no other way for you to get a better item. So as a consequence, rare item drops felt incredible, and every single rare item that dropped was worth identifying, because that was the only way to get good rare items to begin with. Now, when we progressed from Diablo 1 to Diablo 2, the number of crafting systems went up. And so let's see what that is, because Diablo 2, even by Chris Wilson himself, is praised as having an extremely valuable system for ground loot, where both magic and rare items that naturally occurred could offer modifiers that you couldn't get any other way. And Chris Wilson himself has talked about in a video with Mr. Llama, reminiscing about the early days of Diablo 2, that that's the system that he felt the most impactful. He thought that Diablo 2 was the system worthy of emulating. Now, I'm not saying that you need to think that. I'm just offering a history lesson, so when you hear Chris Wilson refer to ground loot, you know what he means. So why was ground loot so good in Diablo 2? Well, it's partially because crafting was extremely limited in the game. For example, if you look at the only thing that I would say is a real crafting system, which is being able to create crafted items, that's the name for the system, there were extremely limited recipes for getting extremely limited modifiers for your items. For example, here are all of the caster items that you can craft. You can craft, for example, a caster helm, and that caster helm would have a relatively high crafting cost, where it would cost you a rune, it would cost you a jewel, it would cost you a gem, and then you would get, frankly, mediocre modifiers. The design language of PoE2 is a little bit different from the design language of Diablo 2, but how valuable would a helm be to you in Diablo in PoE2 if it had 4% mana leech, 20% increased mana regeneration, and 200 max mana? Not that valuable, right? So as a consequence, these are really just only exist to sort of push up the floor of gear, or to help you meet breakpoints, where your teleport takes 9 frames, but if you get a tiny amount of increased cast speed, it would take 8 frames, and that would mean that you could move faster. And so you would only ever really be crafting in most play circumstances, not all. Extremely limited examples of faster cast rate, for example, these could be good, and only if you need it specifically to EQ over a breakpoint. And that meant that if you found a ring on the ground that had plus 10 strength, plus 10 dexterity, and double res with a little bit of cast speed, that was like an unbelievable 1 in 1,000 drop. Because it was so much better than what was available to craft that you literally couldn't get anything better at all. There were, of course, uniques that were better than that, and there were set items that you can interact with. But if you wanted a good rare item, or if you needed to meet a particular breakpoint, ground loot drops, in particular identifying rare circlets, rare rings, rare gloves, and even some magic items that would give bonuses to skill levels, was just the only way to get certain modifiers. And since Diablo 2 has a lot of abundant breakpoints because of the way that game engine works, meeting those breakpoints can be super important, and that's a common gearing goal during Diablo 2 leveling. The only other crafting systems that are really worth mentioning is that the socketable system in Diablo 2, where you get runes that work much like runes that in their base form work much like socketable runes in PoE2, is pretty normal. For example, you can get cannot be frozen, or you can get tiny amounts of hit recovery, or you can get tiny amounts of resistance, or you can get tiny amounts of mana on kill from various runes. Similar effects to what you get from low-level runes in PoE2. But these can be used to create what are called rune words, and rune words are incredibly strong, but also incredibly specific. So I'll give you an example. If you think about the most common leveling rune word, which is stealth, stealth offers a number of modifiers that nearly all builds want, that being 25% faster run walk, 25% faster hit recovery, magic damage reduced by 3, which is a subtractive modifier to your mana damage taken, and a little bit of maximum stamina. These other modifiers, dexterity, poison resist, mana regen, and faster cast rate, are relevant only to some builds. For example, if you're a weapon user, an Amazon or a barbarian, the faster cast rate doesn't really do much for you. But it does mean that you have a guaranteed floor of leveling chests, and in fact, if you're unfamiliar, stealth is so strong that it's functionally mandatory for leveling, even though it has multiple dead stats for you. Because faster run walk, faster hit recovery, and faster cast rate are so strong that you just have to wear it, because there are no other good low-level rune words available. However, even the absolute best rune word for melee classes, which is Grief, has a bunch of really odd stats on it. It's extremely strong, don't get me wrong. Grief is probably the best melee weapon in the game for 99.999% of players, but because there's no way to craft better rare items, a theoretically perfect rare item is better than Grief. If you don't believe me, you can check out the duel between Mr. Llama and Cooley, in which the most famous rare item ever generated in Diablo 2 Resurrected, Wraithcrack, a legendary mallet, actually beats Grief in a melee duel. The only other thing to say is that sockets in Diablo 2 worked different than they do in PoE2. It's not something that you can very easily add to an item. And all of this means that because your crafting options are so limited, with sockets essentially only being addable by talking to Larzuk, although I believe that there's a Heraldric Cube recipe as well, that this is it. This is the crafting system of Diablo 2. You get a couple of basic cube recipes if you need very specific, very limited stats, and then you have rune words, and adding sockets is really quite cumbersome. So if you find a good rare item with good resistances or good base stats, that's super exciting, and part of the reason that that's super exciting is because you can't deterministically get anything. So every time you kill a mob and a rare item drops, it feels like you're pulling the lever on the slot machine, and the dopamine hit of finding that randomly occurring thing, because it's incredibly rare, is super high. So if we look at crafting in PoE2 as a comparison, why does ground loot feel bad in PoE2? Again, using my perhaps unusual definition, but my history-informed definition of ground loot, by which I mean naturally occurring rare items. Why are naturally occurring rare items so bad in PoE 2? Well, it's because we have such good crafting options. Like, I just grabbed a screenshot of my currency tab, my essence tab, and my sockets tab, which aren't particularly well stocked at the moment. But just think about the amount of item power that exists just in these 3 screenshots. Like, if you needed something, a specific resistance, a specific item modifier, a specific amount of mana leech, if you wanted a certain type of flat damage on your weapon, just think about what you could do with like a couple essences of haste and battle, a perfect essence of lightning, your basic essence crafting tools. And this isn't to mention items like omens and abyss crafting and any other options that we get in the future. What that means is that compared to the potency of crafting options, finding a rare item that's good is impossible. And I want to do a little bit of math with you, and then I want to ask you the question in the comments: do you actually want this system nerfed? I probably don't think that you do, and I certainly don't. But if people are saying that they want ground loot to feel better, I'm curious what proposals exist. And we can talk about what PoE 2 does well on that front and what PoE 2 could implement, though I'm not advocating for a change personally. So if we just talk about, not even about mirror tier items, okay? So like here's a siege crossbow that's like not quite mirror tier, but extremely good with tier 1 IPD, tier 1 flat fizz, crit chance, attack speed, and plus levels, and then we slammed on some essence stuff, right? So here's an extremely good crossbow. Forget this extremely good crossbow for a second, and let's just talk about like your basic day 3 of League essence craft. You find an item that has like 2 decent modifiers, in this case tier 3 IPD or tier 2 IPD and some critical strike chance, And then you can add everything else with relatively cheap, relatively common essences. For example, this is a greater essence of abrasion. This is a perfect essence of lightning. This is from an essence, and this is from an essence. So let's just talk about a fake math example, just to illustrate the point of how hard it would be for a ground loot item to beat this budget craft. Again, crafting this on the 2nd or 3rd day of League would probably cost you 3 or 4 div, depending on the economy. And that means that from that point on, you're just not going to find a weapon that's better. So I'm aware that the math example that I'm about to give is flawed. You don't need to tell me in the comments. We're just trying to keep everybody with us in the conversation without being as mathematically and statistically nuanced as we could be. So let's just make the point. Let's pretend that the way that the item generation algorithm works in PoE 2 is that rolls happen sequentially. The same as would happen if we took a wet item, added a transmute, added an augment, and added a regal. Let's pretend that that's how it works. So let's take a look. If we wanted something significantly better than this item, let's just pretend that we want increased physical damage, flat physical damage, and plus levels. What's the chance that if we just take a transmute and slam it onto a white crossbow, that we get tier 1 physical damage as our first modifier? Well, the answer is that it's 0.056%. That's not 0.56%. That's 0.056%, or around 1 in 1,800. Then let's suppose that the next thing that we want to have happen is to either get tier 1 or tier 2 levels. So +5, +6, or +7. The combined probability of these things happening is around 0.6%. So around 1 in 160, approximately. Then, if we regaled it, what would be the chance that we would get specifically tier 1 flat physical damage? It would be, assuming that the weights on PoE 2DB are correct, 0.25%. If you multiply these 3 numbers together, then what you get is 8 times 10 to the -9th, if for some reason they needed to be rolled in that order. If you multiply by 6 to account for the fact that we can have them occur in any order, the approximate probability if you find an item level 82 siege crossbow on the ground, untiered, and pick it up and identify it is 4.8 times 10 to the minus 8th. So what's the probability that we find a ground loot item as is without any ability to craft on it, and it's exciting and better than our budget craft before we craft on it? In other words, what are the chances that the loot on the ground is good enough to be worth using in endgame? It's 1 in 4.8 times 10 to the minus 8th. In other words, suppose that you run a T16 map with the appropriate modifiers for you to find 5 siege crossbows in that map, and you really want a siege crossbow. And as you run that whole map, 5 of them drop. You would need to run 100 million such maps before naturally finding such a crossbow. 100 million T16 map clears. In other words, if you completed one T16 map like that every second, it would take you 1,100 days to find such a crossbow. So, if the probability is that low, is it ever worth picking up and identifying rare crossbow bases? No. Never. It's worth picking up white ones, because if they have the correct item level, they can be worth modifying, and it's worth picking up tiered magic items, because it can be worth identifying in case they have one of these good mods and become a good crafting base. But that's pretty much it. So rare items in the endgame on the ground can never be relevant, because that's it. That's why. It's because crafting is strong. If you compare the probability of finding a ground loot item that's as good as a basic budget craft, or especially if you want something better than a basic budget craft, the probabilities are so extreme that it will not happen. Like, I don't need to say it could happen or it happens to one player in the entire server. I mean, if you and 100 friends did this for the entire league non-stop, you wouldn't find one such crossbow. That's crazy. That's crazy. Now, PoE2 has other systems to get around this, but a lot of players have been clamoring for ground loot to feel better. And if you don't like the systems that already exist, that means that you don't like exceptional bases. That means that you don't like tiered magic items. That means that you don't like chase uniques as they exist, or that you want modifications to those systems. But I don't think that you mean what ARPG creators have been praising Diablo 2 for, including what Chris Wilson praised Diablo 2 for, which is that rare, unmodifiable items are super exciting. And that's because rare, unmodifiable items in PoE2 can't be exciting unless you delete crafting. Not delete crafting, but nerf it. I just have to say some rage bait so people will type things in the comments. So let's talk about what PoE2 does well. Exceptional bases are super interesting because over quality can't be crafted and extra sockets can't be crafted. Additionally, tiered magic items can have high-level modifiers, and that essentially just saves you the trouble of buying the white base and then slamming on tiered transmutes until you find it. Until you find the mod you want. But there's another thing that could be done to make rare items super worth IDing, though it would to some extent concentrate the problem. And that would be if there were drop-only modifiers that couldn't be crafted. That's at least one idea. I'm interested to hear if you guys have other ideas or if you guys like that idea. For example, what if tier 1 increased physical damage couldn't occur from tiered crafting items? Interesting. What if the maximum number of plus levels couldn't occur from crafting? Meaning I can't take a white or blue item and no amount of chaos spamming will ever get me tier 1. That would mean that identifying items on the ground would be worth it, because although it would take some luck on the annul in order for you to do it, or spending multiple whittlings in order for you to remove the lower tier modifiers, you would at least have a chance that every single item on the ground has the best possible modifiers, and that would mean that hitting it feels really good. That's one option. I'm sure that there are others. I'm sure that you guys have good ideas. But if we talk about wanting rare items on the ground to be valuable in the endgame, they just can't be right now. And That's because PoE2 lacks a system for making items anywhere close to as powerful as you can craft, even a basic budget craft. And that's in contrast with earlier games like Diablo 1 and 2, where ground loot feels incredibly impactful because these are the crafting options. And especially in Diablo 1, the only crafting option is getting lucky and finding a shrine. So I don't think that most people, when they talk about wanting better ground loot, actually mean the same thing that I mean when I say that I don't want ground loot to be better. And I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts about this. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.